大家好，欢迎收看今天的全球瞭望，我是郭崇伦。我们今天要访问的是美国布鲁金斯学会的卜睿哲先生，他最近在台湾访问，他对于美国对于两岸的关系，乃至于对于美台关系是大家所一向敬重的。我们今天就跟他来谈，从美国的政策到美台关系以及中美之间最近的纷争。
It's my great pleasure. Thank you for the opportunity.
First of all, I want to ask you, let's go back to about 3 or 4 years ago, when there's a sudden change of U.S. perception about China. And my question is, what caused this? I mean, it happened not only politically, it's a bilateral, bipartisan thing, it also happened in business community and also in policy and academic. And what is the reason for that?
Well, it's an excellent question. I would start my answer by saying that when it comes to China, there has always been a spectrum of American opinion. And the people who specialize on China in various fields, there's a range of views. I think what has happened in the last 5 or 10 years is that the spectrum has moved in a negative direction. So somebody who started out in a very pro-China position 20, 30 years ago, they're more skeptical. Someone who was in the middle is becoming more worried about what China's doing. Hardliners, they say, oh, this is what we knew all along. What's the big surprise? But I think the spectrum has moved. You know, my own opinions about China have changed over the last 10 years. And I think, frankly, it's because China has changed. And its behavior externally and the way it runs its economy has changed. So for a long time, the business community in the United States was the strongest supporter of U.S.-China relations. And I remember from working in the Congress that if we wanted to defend a more positive policy towards China, the business community was our main ally. Because they could make the argument. They could say, the future of our company depends on the United States having a mutually beneficial economic relationship with China.
That's the same view by China. China always say that the business and economic relations is the bedrock of the bilateral relations.
Okay, what happened though was that more and more American companies were coming to the conclusion that economic relations with China was no longer yielding a result of mutual benefit. That China was taking more and American companies were getting less. And I think that this began over 10 years ago. Maybe it shouldn't have been surprising that China wanted to move up the ladder economically, did not want to be just a platform for the assembly of goods where other companies, outside companies, got all the value. China wanted to produce more of its own know-how and technology, and it thought it could drive a harder bargain with American companies in terms of the terms and conditions of the transfer of technology. And so, you know, some years ago we had the issue of indigenous innovation, where China said it was going to produce a lot more on its own. So now this has become one of the key issues in U.S.-China economic relations, and actually economic relations between China and all advanced economies. That China is changing the rules of the game, and the companies and their governments are not willing to just go along. And so the U.S. government refers to these as structural issues, and they have to do with the business environment in China. And I don't think it's in China's interest, actually, to move away from a situation of mutual benefit. Because I think, on the one hand, they will lose opportunities that they could gain from cooperating with foreign firms, but they also lose a strong ally in the domestic politics of all of China's major partners. So the business community is much more anti-China than it was before, and they looked to Donald Trump to change the situation. They knew that using tariffs as a tool to coerce China to change its policies maybe wasn't the best idea, but they were willing to let him try. So we're in the situation we are now. This is also true, I think, on the security side.
They have been always hawkish of those people, right?
Well, I think China has helped to change people's perception and make people more anxious and hawkish. I think this was somewhat understandable because of the configuration of power in East Asia in the 1950s, 1960s, 70s, and so on. That the United States has been forward deployed in East Asia. We have alliance commitments with a number of friendly countries. We are sitting on the first island chain, and this created insecurity in China. They felt encircled. They felt that if they had to fight a war with the United States, they would be in a very difficult position to fight that war. And so they began to develop capabilities, starting about 20 years ago, to be able to project power out, to be able to move the defense perimeter out. The problem is that you start clashing with the countries that are already there, mainly the United States and Japan. Now, I'm not saying that conflict is inevitable in this situation. There was a serious attempt on both sides over the course of a year to try and come to some sort of reasonable compromise on economic issues, including structural issues. In 2014, President Barack Obama and President Xi Jinping worked out an understanding about how U.S. naval ships and PLA naval ships would interact in the normal course of operations, how U.S. Air Force planes and PLA Air Force planes would interact in the normal course of operations. Those are very sensible, well-tested conflict avoidance mechanisms. My understanding is that despite all the other difficulties we have with China, those are still working. So it means that the risk of some kind of accidental clash that could then escalate into something much worse remains fairly low. But that's a good thing. But it also proves to us that even difficult situations can be managed in a way that is beneficial for both sides.
But isn't it true that there's a hope in the U.S. that we should engage China and help China to change? Is that kind of expectation disappear within the 3 or 4 years of this period, or there's still some hope that U.S. can change China in that sense?
This is a bit of a complicated issue because there are some analysts in the United States, let's call them strategists, who are creating a narrative that people like me, China specialists, Asia specialists, had the idea that by engaging China, we could make it a democracy. Now, I think this is a straw man.
It had been a straw man all along?
Yes, well, I think so. I think, there were specific points where this argument was made for a specific purpose. So when it came time to create permanent normal trading status for China vis-a-vis the United States, President Clinton basically made this argument. But I think most people who understood China, wherever they were on this spectrum, they understood that certainly democratization, if it came, was going to take a long time. That this kind of political evolution, which is one part of social modernization, has to take place at a pace that is appropriate for the country concerned and the society concerned. And that we should not be too naive about the possibility of this happening.
They seem to suggest what's happening in Taiwan, in Korea, can also happen in China in a sense.
Well, I myself, had that hope. I don't think I was naive, but I do think that the fact that an ethnic Chinese society that was under an authoritarian system could move gradually and without violence to become a fully democratic system within essentially 1 decade is, first of all, a remarkable achievement. But it's also a source of hope that the Chinese people on the mainland can benefit from the same kind of evolution. Now, we would have to ask the question, where is China today compared to where Taiwan was 30 years ago, 40 years ago, 50 years ago? I lived here 45 years ago, and this was still a pretty tough place at that time. I think democratization came here for some special reasons that may not apply to China. But the general development of human societies is that as you get economic modernization, social modernization, the emergence of a middle class, the satisfaction, relatively speaking, of material needs, people start asking for more. And this may take a long time, but in the case of Taiwan, you had a President Chiang Ching-kuo, who had actually a really novel idea, and that was that the Kuomintang, which had been pretty successful in maintaining power, could continue to maintain its control on power by relaxing controls rather than maintaining them. That is a very novel idea, right? It goes against the sort of control mentality of the Chinese Communist Party, but maybe at some point they'll change. We have to recognize that among people on the mainland today, their personal freedom, not their political freedom, their personal freedom is much greater than it was 30 or 40 years ago. And that's a good thing.
To continue this question, to what degree is China itself bringing it upon themselves? Which I mean that some people are saying that with the new leadership, Xi Jinping, that it's saying about the China dream in the future, or even the abolition of the term limit by the state chairman, is something that is really disappointing a lot of people, especially in the United States, about this hope, this expectation that China can eventually change into a more democratic society. Well,
I think this is complicated. Xi Jinping's cancellation of term limits for the office of state chairman was a disappointment. We don't fully understand why he made that decision. Now, it may be that he felt that he was not going to be able to complete the economic reforms that he wanted to complete as long as term limits were in place, because bureaucrats would just wait. That's maybe the most charitable explanation, and it seems now that maybe his faith in economic reform is not so great. I think the more significant reason for what we're seeing, not only in China itself, but also in Hong Kong and Xinjiang and so on, is that President Xi Jinping has a greater concern, you might even say obsession, about national security than his predecessors did. And for Xi Jinping, he defines national security as both internal and external, and particularly internal. I suspect that the Arab Spring in 2011 spooked Chinese leaders, including Xi Jinping, and they worried that a similar kind of dynamic could take place in China, because the social conditions seemed to be present. And so as soon as he became General Secretary, he mounted a focus on national security and building up the apparatus for protecting national security. And there are a whole set of institutions and guidelines and laws that were put forward. And these have been applied mainly in Xinjiang, but I think in the intellectual community as well. I think that this concern for national security had an impact on the way the effort to bring about electoral reform in Hong Kong ended up in 2014, 2015. I think it should be a concern for people in Taiwan. One can hope that the PRC leadership could sit back at some point and say, well, we've dealt with this problem. Maybe we overreacted to this problem, and now we can afford to loosen up some. And I don't know when that will happen. I think China will be a better place when it does happen. But I think that to a great extent the CCP brought these problems on itself.
You just mentioned in your talk that the confrontation or the tension, is it irreversible? And looking, are we going to see this kind of confrontational relationship between China and the U.S. is going to continue for the years to come? Or there's a chance that it can be reversed with a new American president, or with some changes happening in China?
Or both.
Or both?
Yes. Well, I mean, this is the big question, because if you come to the conclusion that there is going to be permanent rivalry and permanent confrontation, then there's nothing you can do but choose between appeasement on the one hand or sort of confrontation on the other. As you understand very well, the mainstream view in the United States is, of course we have difficulties with our relationship with China, that the geography of East Asia and China's sense of insecurity almost determines it. But I think there was a confidence in the Obama administration, the Bush administration, that these things could be managed, that techniques could be developed to reduce the possibility of conflict.
So you don't buy the Thucydides trap argument?
No, I don't. I think that Graham Allison has done us all a service by putting forward this hypothesis and forcing us to think. My own feeling is that each of the cases he looks at that together become the trap have their own unique character. And it's the unique character of each one that produces war or doesn't produce war. I think that the mainstream view in the United States, in addition to the idea that frictions can be managed in many cases, is that finding areas of cooperation is a good thing. It's a good thing for its own sake for China and the United States to cooperate on Iran's nuclear program. It's a good thing for its own sake that we cooperate on North Korea's nuclear program to the extent that we can. It's a good thing that we cooperate together on climate change, and so on and so on and so on. But cooperation on these things also provides a foundation for the relationship that gives leaders greater confidence that they can and should manage the confrontation. One key variable here is how the institutions of each system analyze the intentions of the other. As if the American system, particularly under Donald Trump, and the Chinese system, particularly under Xi Jinping, each come to the conclusion that the intentions of the other country are fundamentally hostile to us, then there's no choice. If we are more careful in how we analyze the intentions of the other, and if we try at least a little bit to put ourselves in the shoes of the other side and understand why they may be doing the things they're doing, then that creates a different environment for policy. But I think that the signals coming out of the Trump administration aren't so good in this regard. So you have the national security strategy, the open summary of the national defense strategy, now the East Asia strategy. They all, have a common theme, that China's a revisionist power. It wants to drive the United States from East Asia. And the only choice for the United States here, for them at least, is strategic competition on many different fronts at once. So perhaps in 2021, when maybe the United States has a new president, there will be a reassessment of this very negative view of China's intentions and China's behavior. I don't know.
But you just mentioned that it's not only the president, but also all the officials,
Yes.
mid-level, lower level, they are having somewhat like a consensus, should be tough on China,
Yes.
should be aware of what China has been doing. My question is mostly on a generation of different Chinese scholars. I mean, if you are involved with the normalization of relation between China and the United States, you have a different view than the people that have experienced the '96 street crisis.
Yes.
And it's also very different with now the NSC senior director, Mr. Pottinger, who have been bullied by the Chinese security when he was a reporter in China. So they have their own background of
Yes.
acknowledgement about what China
Yes.
is. So that makes the difference of a policy coming out. Do you care to comment on that? A different generation of Chinese expert perception about China.
Well, I think that this is almost inevitable. You know, I began my professional career on China in the late 1970s, and I had read about the McCarthy period and how that affected a generation of China people. But I didn't experience it. So similarly, you know, if you weren't involved in any way with normalization, if you weren't involved in any way with Tiananmen, if all you've seen is a China that is step by step becoming more powerful and in a way a little more aggressive, you're going to have a different mentality. I mean, what you need is a set of institutions that can correct misimpressions, that can provide some context and some alternative views of what's happening. I actually think that in general our system is better at doing this than the Chinese system, but it requires an openness on the part of the new generation of rising officials to listen to this perspective, and it requires skill on the part of the veterans to do a good job in explaining. And you can't just say, "Oh, you're young, you don't understand." Trust me, that doesn't work.
Finally, I would like to ask you about how did other countries in the world see the tension between China and the United States, which translate into another expression is, are they being asked to take side on this conflict and tension? I mean, China these days have begun a charm offensive, and try to woo over India, Japan, European country, even ASEAN countries. And while the American President Trump seemed to manage to offend every ally he can find in the world. So how should other countries see the tension, and are they going to have to take side in the end?
Well, this is a very serious question. And I think that the attraction of China for many of our friends and allies has been a phenomenon for a long time. And it shouldn't be surprising that for the countries of East Asia at least, and for countries in Europe and South Asia, China is a big source of their prosperity. But for these same countries, the United States was and has been a source of their security. Fortunately, so far, China restrained itself and did not push these countries to make a choice. The United States did not force these countries to make a choice. And it was actually in our interest that they not be forced to make a choice. I think what we have seen in the last 2.5 years is a lack of understanding of the complexity of the situation that our friends and allies exist in. And there is, first of all, a tendency to take steps that work against the interests of our friends, like steel and aluminum tariffs, for example, which has affected Taiwan, imposing tariffs on nominally Chinese products when most of the value added is done here. So, if we were to increase the tariffs on iPhones, Taiwan would pay more of a cost than, well, it doesn't take a genius to figure out that the negative consequences, the side effects of what you're doing. I think this area of technology and the negative way in which some in the Trump administration view technological competition may be another basis on which we might say to our friends, you do have to choose. That if you're a company in Taiwan or Korea or Japan, excuse me, and you have partners in the United States and partners in China, that's a dangerous situation for us. And I hope we don't get to that. That seems to be possible. And it could be that everybody loses in the end.
We're going to take a short break.
Okay.
我们等一下回来继续跟卜睿哲先生谈台湾，尤其是在跟美国的关系，还有跟中国大陆关系，应该要采取什么样子的对策。我们等一下回来继续谈。